Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Warlock 2 The Exiled, along with all of its DLCs and its major expansion pack Wrath of the Nagas for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a 4X turn-based strategy game and the sequel to Warlock Master of the Arcane. It was developed by Ino-Co Plus and published by Paradox Interactive in 2014 for PC, Mac, and Linux, and it was generally pretty decently received, although it wasn't a wildly huge success all around. The general consensus around the time of the game's release was that it was mostly just more of the same as what we saw in Warlock Master of the Arcane, which had released 2 years prior and was seen as something of a revival of the gameplay style of something along the lines of Master of Magic, which, if you're not familiar, was a classic 4X strategy game where you played as a great mage and you had to research spells and, of course, command your units around the map and all that sort of thing. And Warlock basically took that and updated everything to be very similar to the mechanics of Civilization V. So, what exactly do you get with Warlock 2 The Exiled? Does it actually change things up pretty significantly, or is it really just more of the same? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. And we'll go ahead and start like we usually do with the presentation, where you really would be hard-pressed to tell the difference between Warlock 2 and the first Warlock game, because they look almost identical in terms of the graphics. Now, of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the original Warlock actually looked quite good, and it did have a pretty interesting aesthetic going on, where it's based on the universe that was set up in the two Majesty games, and it looks a lot more like Majesty 2 than it does Majesty 1. But regardless, you're dealing with something that has kind of a semi-cartoony, almost fairy tale aesthetic, and it does lend the game a fair bit of charm. That said, there is a lot of asset reuse between the original Warlock and Warlock 2, where you have all three of the original main factions returning from Warlock 1, as well as the DLC faction, the Arethi Elves, and Warlock 2 also introduces two new factions on top of them, the Planestriders and the Svarts, and with the Wrath of the Nagas expansion, you also have the Naga faction. So out of the 7 total factions available in the game, 4 of them are reused from Warlock Master of the Arcane, and all of their assets are reused. So that means that at a glance, the only way you can really tell the difference visually between the original Warlock and Warlock 2 is if you're looking at the 3 new factions, which do have their own specific look and feel as well, so that's definitely appreciated. And they're up to the same standard of quality that you saw from the original Warlock, so that's also good. But anyway, the only real way to tell the difference at a first glance is either to look at one of the 3 new factions and be able to tell the difference between those and the old factions, or by looking at the interface, which still looks very similar to the original game's interface, but with some additional functionality that just makes the game easier to navigate. So they did improve the interface, but again, like with the factions, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between the original Warlock and Warlock 2 at first glance, unless you had played a fair bit of the original Warlock and really knew how that game looked. So that does end up being a bit disappointing, but at least the visuals themselves still look pretty solid across the board. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. With the exception of the content that is brand new to Warlock 2, nearly everything from sound effects to voice clips to even the music was reused from the original Warlock. And that wouldn't necessarily be as much of an issue if a lot of those weren't taken directly from Majesty 2, which released back in 2009. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're not bad sound effects or voice clips by any stretch of the imagination, but when they're reused across multiple games across 5 years, it does wear on you quite a bit. The music, at least, is original to the Warlock subseries, so you only have 2 years of difference between those, but even then, with so much of that being reused from the original Warlock, it just ends up creating a sense of deja vu. But as for the stuff that was actually added in Warlock 2, it's up to the same standard of quality as the original Warlock Master of the Arcane, and it does certainly help to give Warlock 2 just about as much charm as the original Warlock had. So at least it's consistent, but unfortunately, again, it just creates a sense of deja vu and ultimately ends up being a pretty disappointing presentation overall. But as disappointing as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this takes place in sort of Ardania, or at least Ardania is part of it, and the idea is that the world has actually been split into multiple multiple smaller shard worlds, so to speak, where all the different great mages have been exiled to their own shards with their own specific factions. And the idea is that whatever faction you decide to play is ultimately trying to fight its way back to Ardania and defeat the so-called United One, so you can ultimately reclaim Ardania for yourself and have your bloody revenge upon those who exiled you in the first place. And as you would really expect from a 4X turn-based strategy game, that's mostly just a setup for the actual gameplay. There's barely any actual story to this thing, and you're mostly just going to be focusing more on the mechanics than anything else. The same sort of thing happens with the Wrath of the Nagas expansion as well, where it introduces an additional story campaign where you're ultimately working to try to stop the Nagas from invading all the different worlds and basically just destroying them. Of those two story campaigns, the Exiled campaign, where you're ultimately trying to make your way back to Ardania and defeat the United One, is definitely the more interesting of the two, although neither of them are particularly good. Again, these are story campaigns in the sense of they actually have a setup, but there's not really any actual story to the campaigns themselves. They're just a string of different worlds for you to fight on until eventually you manage to make it all the way to the end and defeat the final enemy. So while those campaigns are generally pretty decent for at least a single playthrough, you're probably going to find that you're going to want to actually just play the sandbox mode a lot more, and that's more or less intact from the original Warlock with some slight tweaks here and there, mostly to accommodate a few new mechanics, most notably the sort of portal system that they have set up, where they do have that broken worlds thing in the actual main sandbox mode as well, and you can either start on one of the plane worlds, or you can start in Ardania and navigate to the different plane worlds in order to try to conquer those as well. They've also made a few other tweaks to the general gameplay, which includes things like altering some of the victory modes. So you still have the basic conquest mode where you're trying to defeat all of the other mages. You have the defeat an avatar mode where if you are able to defeat an avatar of a god, then you're able to win the game immediately. You still have the cast the unity spell victory, but the difference here is in how you actually get to that victory, because you have different levels of research, and as you continue to research new spells, you'll find that you have a certain number of spells that you have to research in a particular category before you can advance to the next tier of spells. And once you've managed to reach the end tier of spells for both wizardry and sorcery spells, then you have the ability to research the unity spell, which once you cast that will actually win the game. Beyond that, the rest of the victory conditions are more or less the same. You still have the capture the holy grounds victory mode, and in the story mode you also have the defeat the United One victory condition. But other than that, the sandbox mode is pretty much exactly the same as it was in Warlock 1 with those slight tweaks, and of course with the extra content of the new factions, as well as a couple new great mages and things like that. Aside from the two story campaigns, DLC included of course, and the sandbox mode, there's also a Battle for the Outplanes mode, which is basically just the Exiled campaign, but without any of the actual story content from the Exiled campaign, so it's really just a skirmish mode version of that. So this means you have two story campaigns, a semi-sandbox mode based on one of the story campaigns, and then a full-on sandbox mode with completely randomly generated maps and such like that, that is just a carryover from the original Warlock. And then of course there is the multiplayer on top of that, but I never got to mess around with the multiplayer because basically nobody is playing multiplayer anymore. So what about the actual core gameplay of Warlock 2? Did they make any real significant changes there? How did the new factions stack up? What exactly is going on there? Well, in terms of the new factions, as I said, you have effectively 3 new factions because all 4 of the others return from the original Warlock. You have the Planestriders, you have the Nagas, which are only available if you have the Wrath of the Nagas DLC, and you have the Svarts. The Svarts are basically a very heavily research-focused faction with some very heavily armored and very powerful units, but they're also quite expensive. The Planestriders are something of a mixture between the original 3 factions that were in the first Warlock game, which were the humans, undead, and monsters, and so they sort of end up being a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none faction. And then of course there are the Nagas, who excel at one thing and one thing only, and that is being in the water. Their units can can traverse both land and water, but if they're on the land, then they have reduced movement, and they also have generally reduced capabilities on top of that. Whereas if they're in the water, then they're actually quite powerful. Here's the thing though, the vast majority of the time you're not going to be fighting in the water, so it ends up being very situational at absolute best, and at worst, most of the time you're just going to be at a pretty significant disadvantage compared to all of the other factions. As for the Great Mages, roughly half of them return in some fashion from the original Warlock, and the rest are all new additions that are mostly in keeping with what you would pretty much expect from the Great Mages in the original Warlock, but of course designed to meet the needs of the new factions, as well as some redesigns to keep things a bit fresh for the existing factions. And on top of that, you can also customize all of the different traits of the different rulers, and even change their name if you'd like, so they mostly just end up being more of a template than anything else. But what about the actual core gameplay? Did that really change up any? Well, to some degree it did, but most of the tweaks are fairly slight changes that were made more for either balancing reasons or just to make the gameplay a bit smoother and easier to run. The thing is, most of those changes were under the hood, so you probably aren't going to notice them too much. I did already mention that they did change up the research a fair bit, and the new research system is definitely an improvement over the kind of random crap we had in the original Warlock. But that's not the only noticeable change they made. They also made some tweaks to the interface to make things a bit easier to navigate and give you more information on screen. And the biggest change they made was putting in a hard limit on the number of cities you can actually support. So that starts out at 5 cities and can be increased with a leader trait called Arcane, which will give you additional 2 that you can build. And if you don't have the Archon trait, there's always research you can do to increase the limit as well. So it's not always a hard limit of just 5 cities, but even that is a bit misleading because it's not just 5 cities in general. So the way it actually works is you have basic cities where you can actually build up structures in the hexes that make up that city and gradually build up your ability to produce units, as well as just give yourself more capabilities for, say, enhancements like building things on different resources to be able to give your different units certain specific enhancements or anything along those lines. Or you can convert a city into a special city. Now this can either be a temple city, which is devoted to a specific god of Ardania, in which case you will gain quite a bit of favor with whatever god of Ardania you've picked for that particular temple city, and when you hit a new level of favor, you'll unlock an additional spell that you can research in the Divine Spells track, which is exclusive to that particular god's favor. But if you don't want to build a temple city, you can always build one of the other 2 types, which are either a free city, which basically just gives you a tribute in money, or you can convert a city into a fortress city, which will gradually improve its power over time and will basically serve as an incredibly powerful fortress that allows you to establish a pretty significant defensive front. And one of the major advantages of these different special kinds of cities is that when you actually convert a city into a special city, it no longer counts towards your city limit. So let's say you have 5 cities built and you want to build a new one. Well, you can always, of course, do some research to improve your cap on the number of cities you can have, or if you don't want to wait for that, then you can always train a settler and then go and create a new city, but then convert that immediately to a special city so you don't suffer any of the ill effects of going over the city cap. Because you can do that. You can go over the city cap, but the further you go over that, the higher your unrest will climb, and as your unrest climbs, your production capabilities decrease pretty significantly. To make matters a bit more complicated, this also includes cities you capture by conquest. So if you go to war with one of the other great mages and you end up capturing some of their cities, then you might very well go over the city cap and start generating quite a lot of unrest and have some pretty significant production problems. And so you'll want to try to convert some of those into either temple or free cities or even fortress cities, and you'll find that you actually can't, at least not at first. You see, there's a period of cooldown between when you capture that city and when you actually are able to convert it into a special city. So those are things you have to plan around, and if you're going to be doing a lot of conquest, then you probably don't want to actually capture a lot of cities all at once, or if you do, you probably want to either raze them to the ground or convert maybe one of the other cities that you have that you're not really planning on doing much with into a special city, so you don't start suffering from the unrest that's generated from going over your city cap. So the new city limit and associated unrest mechanic definitely changes up the dynamic of gameplay a bit, but here's the thing, that's the only truly major change to the gameplay. Most of the other stuff is under the hood, as I said before, so it's pretty much impossible to notice most of the actual changes to gameplay, and it does end up feeling extremely similar to Warlock 1, especially when you factor in that they never really improved the AI as well. It's still incredibly dumb, and it basically has to cheat in order to win. So the game's difficulty can oscillate wildly between ridiculously easy because the AI is just completely derping around, to incredibly difficult because the AI is just completely BSing you. And that can happen regardless of what difficulty setting you have the game on. So if you're just starting out and just trying to learn the mechanics, and you find that the AI is just constantly stomping you into the ground, that can be incredibly frustrating to deal with. By the same token, if you've already played Warlock 1 and you're used to that difficulty and don't really find any problems because you just know exactly what you need to do, then you'll probably find the game rather easy because you can just exploit all the same AI problems that were in the original Warlock. And that sort of thing is ultimately what makes Warlock 2 a pretty frustrating game overall, because it does make some improvements over the original Warlock. The research system is objectively better, the interface is objectively better, and the city mechanic is actually an improvement overall because they've put more emphasis on making sure your cities are specialized and making sure you're very mindful of how fast you're expanding your empire and such. Unfortunately, the changes to the mechanics are mostly under the hood and mostly just not even really noticeable. The AI problems that were present in the original Warlock, which ultimately made them either cheating up the wazoo or just complete pushovers, are still present in Warlock 2, and most importantly, the game just ultimately feels like a glorified expansion pack. And if it were released as an actual expansion pack for the original Warlock instead of a standalone game, I could see it actually being better received than it was and actually being a pretty significant improvement overall. But unfortunately, they released it as a full-on sequel to the original Warlock and even released some DLC for Warlock 2 on top of that, which still didn't really add all that much to the game. So you're basically paying the full price for this particular game, which I believe was $40 on launch, for what was maybe a $20 expansion's worth of content. But here's the thing, that's also including the Wrath of the Nagas content, and that's an additional $15 on top of what you're going to be paying for Warlock 2 in and of itself. And even worse, that's also including the additional 2 DLCs they put out for the game, which give you a grand total of 6 new lords to mess around with. Those are, of course, unique units that are particularly powerful and that you can equip special gear on, but they put out 3 of them in each pack, and each pack is another $5. So you're dealing with a base game of, I believe, again, $40 on launch. Now it's down to $20, but you're paying an additional $25 on top of that for all the extra content, and it's just not worth it. That's not to say that Warlock 2 is an outright bad game, but it's definitely a rather disappointing one in the wake of the original Warlock. If they had just released this as an expansion pack for the original Warlock, then it probably would have been fine. But instead, they released it as a full standalone game, and with it being so very similar to the original Warlock, on top of just not having particularly interesting new content apart from the 3 new factions, and of course giving you a fair bit of extra DLC to waste your money on top of that, it just ends up being something that I can't really give any more than a 2.5 out of 5. It's just a really underwhelming, disappointing experience. Thanks for watching.